Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to have you near the lamplight once more. Tell me, have you ever pressed your hand to a blank page, wondering what faint impression yesterday left behind? Watson learned that even erased things leave their mark if one has patience enough to look. Do subscribe so no faded trace escapes you. Now, lean in. For as Holmes believed, nothing is truly hidden, only waiting to be seen. Find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked below. The Gentleman Behind the Frosted Glass. It was upon a bitter evening in January, when the fog rolled up from the river in slow, deliberate coils, and the gas lamps of Baker Street burned with that peculiar orange dimness which only a truly wretched night can produce, that I climbed the familiar 17 steps to the rooms of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had been detained at my practice later than I wished, and it was close upon 9 o'clock before I pushed open the door and felt the welcome warmth of the fire upon my face. Holmes was seated at the table beneath the lamp, and he did not look up at my entrance, so entirely was his attention absorbed by a single sheet of blank paper, which he held at an angle to the light. "Come in, Watson, and shut out that abominable night," said he, without turning his head. "You will find the Tantalus on the sideboard, and I should recommend a rather generous measure, for you have the look of a man who has walked the length of Marylebone Road in search of a cab that does not exist. You have deduced as much from my boots, I suppose? From your boots, and from the fact that it is 9 o'clock and you dine at 7:30. He set down the paper at last and regarded me with that quick, bright glance which missed nothing. "But come, look at this, and tell me what you make of it." I took the sheet from him. It appeared at first glance entirely blank, but when I held it as he had done, tilting it so that the lamplight fell obliquely across its surface, I perceived the faint ghost of an impression, a circular device, perhaps 1.5 inches across, pressed into the fibres of the paper, though no wax or ink remained upon it. "A seal of some kind," I ventured, "pressed upon this sheet while it lay beneath another. Excellent, Watson. You improve. It is the impression of an official seal, and a peculiar one. Note the double eagle and the small crown above the shield, which you will not find upon any seal issued by Her Majesty's Government. It is Corinthian, unless I'm much mistaken, and I picked it from among a dealer's box of old dispatch papers this very afternoon, out of nothing more than idle curiosity as to how such a thing had strayed so far from home." He took the sheet back from me and studied it once more. I confess it has occupied my thoughts rather more than it deserves. There is something in the persistence of these small forgotten states, their seals, their tribunals, their long memories, which I find more instructive than the freshest sensation in the morning papers. He might have said more, for Holmes in a reflective humour was not easily diverted, but at that moment we heard the bell ring below, followed by the murmur of Mrs. Hudson's voice, and a lighter, more agitated one in reply. Holmes cocked his head like a hound that has caught a distant scent. A visitor, and an anxious one, if I am any judge of a footstep upon a staircase. Listen to him take the stairs 2 at a time and then check himself, as though remembering that a gentleman does not run. We shall know the whole story in a moment, Watson, unless I am very much mistaken. The door opened to admit a young man of perhaps 30 years, dressed with the neat, unremarkable correctness of a government clerk, though his collar was slightly disarranged, and there was a high colour in his cheeks that owed nothing to the cold outside. He carried his hat in both hands, turning it about as a nervous man will turn any object that comes within his reach. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I must beg your pardon for the hour, but I did not know where else to turn. My name is Edwin Lark. I am a clerk in the Extradition Department of the Foreign Office, and I have this evening lost a document of the very first importance." "Pray sit down, Mr. Lark, and compose yourself," said Holmes, indicating the chair nearest the fire. "A document does not lose itself. It is either mislaid through carelessness, which is a matter for your superiors, or it is taken through design, which is a matter for me. Let us determine which, before you distress yourself further. Begin at the beginning, if you please, and omit nothing, however trivial it may appear to you." Mr. Lark sat, though he did not relax, and told his story with the halting precision of a man who has rehearsed it many times in his own mind and finds it no easier for the rehearsal. "The document in question," said he, "was a sealed extradition order addressed for delivery to Scotland Yard, authorising the arrest of one Alexander Vorick, a Corinthian subject residing in London under, we believe, an assumed name. Warwick stands accused, upon a warrant nearly 25 years old, of the murder of a royal official in the city of Drasna, and of treason against the Corinthian crown. The order was entrusted to me this afternoon, sealed within a red dispatch wallet to be carried from Whitehall directly to the Yard. Directly, repeated Holmes. And yet you did not go directly. Lark flushed. I was obliged to attend, for a portion of the evening, a diplomatic reception at the house of Sir Claudius Merivale, in Regent's Park. It had been arranged before I received the order, and my superior did not think it worth altering since the reception lay upon my route, and I intended to remain but a few minutes. I carried the wallet with me, naturally, never suspecting— He broke off. You set it down, said Holmes, not as a question, for perhaps a quarter of an hour, no more, in Sir Claudius's private library, where several of the gentlemen had withdrawn to smoke. I did not think it worth remarking upon, Mr. Holmes. No soul there could have known what the wallet contained. It bears no mark to distinguish it from 100 others that pass through the department in a week. And yet it is gone. When I came to look for it, not an hour later, it had vanished from the table where I had left it. I searched the library, I questioned the servants, I even, I'm ashamed to say, searched the pockets of my own coat 3 times over, as though I might have imagined the whole affair. It is not there, Mr. Holmes. It is lost in the house, and I do not know how I am to explain it, for the order is nothing less than an instrument of state, and its disappearance may cause the gravest embarrassment between 2 governments. Holmes had listened to all this with his eyes half closed and his long fingers laced together beneath his chin, a posture I had come to associate with his most concentrated attention. You keep saying that the order is lost in the house, Mr. Lark. You have said it 3 times now by my count, yet you have offered me no proof that it did not leave the house in someone's pocket within the first 5 minutes. Why are you so certain it remains there? The clerk hesitated, and it seemed to me that he coloured yet further. I do not know that I am certain, Mr. Holmes. It is only that no one left the library in that quarter hour, so far as the servants can attest, and so it seemed natural to suppose— Natural suppositions are the death of accurate investigation, said Holmes a shade impatiently. But let that pass. Tell me instead of the guests in that library, and tell me particularly whether anything was said in your hearing that struck you as curious. There was one thing, Lark admitted, though I confess I attached little importance to it at the time. The name of Warwick happened to be mentioned, quite by chance, as in connection with some old Corinthian business that a gentleman had raised, and Sir Claudius Merivale, our host, dropped the wine-glass he was holding. It shattered upon the hearth. He asked, in a voice I can only describe as unnaturally controlled, whether the man had at last been found. I thought it an odd turn of phrase. Not was he arrested, you understand, but whether he had been found, as one might speak of something long searched for and half despaired of. Holmes opened his eyes fully at this, and I saw the particular light kindle in them that I had learned to associate with the true beginning of a case. Now that, said he, is considerably more interesting to me than the fate of the wallet itself, Mr. Lark. Tell me, did Sir Claudius offer any explanation of his agitation? None. He apologised for his clumsiness and changed the subject almost at once. I should not have thought of it again, save that the wallet vanished not half an hour later in that very room. And who else was present when the name was spoken? Lark named them upon his fingers. Sir Claudius's niece, Miss Helena Merivale, a retired officer, Colonel Adrian Bellairs, a widowed friend of the family, Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt, and Sir Claudius's private secretary, a Mr. Julian Vane, who had, Lark believed, been moving about the room refilling glasses and could not swear to have heard the remark himself. Holmes rose and stood for a moment with his back to the fire, his hands clasped behind him. Mr. Lark, I will look into this matter for you, though I warn you that I take less interest in the recovery of a piece of official paper than in the reason 5 people should conceal, poorly, an old and evidently unhappy acquaintance with a name spoken by chance at a dinner party. Official documents, in my experience, are very rarely stolen for the reasons written upon their face. There is generally something written beneath it, so to speak, that matters a great deal more to the thief. We shall call upon Sir Claudius Merivale tomorrow, and you may tell your superiors that the matter is in hand. Lark thanked us with evident relief and took his leave, and I heard his footstep upon the stair, lighter now, and no longer feigning the dignity that had deserted it on his way up. "Well, Watson," said Holmes when the street door had closed below, "what do you make of our clerk's story?" "A stolen document and a curious reaction from the householder," said I. "It has the shape of a case of state, or perhaps of blackmail." "It has the shape of something a great deal older than either," said Holmes, taking up his pipe from the mantel and filling it with slow deliberation, "though I could not yet tell you its true shape any more than you could reconstruct a man's face from his shadow upon a wall at dusk. But I will tell you this, Watson. A man who drops his wine-glass at the mention of a name he claims not to know is not a man to be dismissed as a minor administrative embarrassment, whatever he may protest to the contrary. We shall go to Merivale House in the morning, and I think you would do well to bring your revolver, though I could not, upon my honour, tell you why I say so." With that enigmatic observation, he lit his pipe and fell silent, and I, knowing better than to press him for conclusions he had not yet formed, took up the evening paper and left him to his thoughts, while the fog pressed close against the windows and the fire settled slowly into embers. Chapter 2. A Dinner of Old Acquaintances. Merivale House stood upon the eastern verge of Regent's Park, a tall and severe building of grey stone whose windows, even at midday, seemed to hold something of the previous night's fog within their panes. It was not a cheerful house, for all its evident wealth, and I remarked as much to Holmes as we mounted the steps. "A house built by a man who valued order above comfort," said Holmes, glancing up at the symmetrical facade. "You will notice that every shutter is fastened at precisely the same angle, Watson, and that the brass of the door furniture has been polished this very morning, though no guests were expected. Sir Claudius, unless I am mistaken, is a gentleman who cannot abide the appearance of disorder, whatever disorder may in fact be simmering beneath his roof." We were admitted by a manservant of grave demeanour, and shown into a library that occupied the whole of the western wing. A long, panelled room, lined to the ceiling with legal volumes and hung about with the curious trophies of a colonial career. A Malay kris crossed with a Corinthian ceremonial dagger above the mantel, a leopard skin before the hearth, and several locked cabinets of dark wood whose keyholes, I observed, showed the bright, unworn brass of recent use. Sir Claudius Merivale received us with the smooth courtesy of a man long accustomed to authority. He was well past 70, spare and upright, with a face that had been burned dark by foreign suns, and now sat oddly pale about the eyes, as though some illness of the spirit had lately drawn the blood from that quarter of him alone. "Mr. Holmes," said he, extending a hand that I noticed was perfectly steady, "I am obliged to you for your interest, though I confess I think the matter scarcely worth a great detective's time. A clerk mislays a government paper at my house, and the whole of Whitehall trembles. It is an embarrassment, no more." "You will forgive me if I judge the matter's importance for myself, Sir Claudius," said Holmes pleasantly. "I understand you were acquainted at one time with the gentleman named in the order." "Acquainted?" The old man's laugh was a shade too loud for the room. "I know nothing of this Warwick beyond what appeared years ago in the diplomatic dispatches. Carinthia is a small state, Mr. Holmes, and its politics were never my especial study, whatever gossip may have reached your clerk's ears." He said this last with a glance that was not quite so steady as his hand had been, and Holmes, I observed, allowed the falsehood, for I could not but feel it was one, to pass without challenge, merely inclining his head and turning the conversation to the guests of the previous evening, several of whom, Sir Claudius informed us, remained in the house or nearby and might be persuaded to speak with us. The first was his niece, Miss Helena Merivale, a young woman of perhaps 25, dark-haired, and possessed of a composure that struck me as unusual in one so young. She answered Holmes's questions with a directness that bordered upon coldness, and when he asked whether she had noticed anything remarkable in her uncle's manner the previous evening, she replied, after the briefest pause, that her uncle's manner was not a subject upon which she considered herself qualified to speak. "You are guarded, Miss Merivale," said Holmes, not unkindly. "I am accurate, Mr. Holmes," she returned. "There is a difference, though I grant that the two are often mistaken for one another in this house." It was a curious remark, and I saw Holmes file it away behind those hooded grey eyes of his, though he pursued it no further at that moment. Colonel Adrian Bellairs proved a heavier, redder man, with the bearing of one who had commanded troops and never quite ceased to expect obedience from the world at large. He informed us, in answer to Holmes's inquiry, that he had known Sir Claudius slightly during his service abroad, though never in Carinthia itself, which country he had, he believed, never visited. "Never visited," Holmes repeated with the mildest possible emphasis, "and yet you spoke, not 5 minutes since, in the hearing of the footman of the town of Dresner, and pronounced it very correctly, with the accent upon the second syllable, as the Corinthians themselves render it, and not upon the first, as an Englishman ignorant of the place would naturally do. Bellaire's ruddy face darkened further, and for a moment I thought he would make some blustering reply, but he only said gruffly that a soldier picks up 100 foreign names in the course of a career and thinks nothing of the pronunciation, and turned the subject with more haste than grace. Mrs. Eleanor Harcourt, a handsome widow of perhaps 60, elegant in her dress and measured in her speech, claimed to have been occupied with the piano for the greater part of the evening, and to have noticed nothing beyond the ordinary talk of a dinner party. Yet when Holmes, almost carelessly, let fall the name of the royal official murdered 25 years before in Drasna, her hands, folded in her lap, trembled visibly, and she was obliged to still them with the other, before she answered that she had never heard the gentleman's name until that moment. Last of the household we saw Mr. Julian Vane, Sir Claudius's private secretary, a slight, quiet man of perhaps 35, who answered every question with a precision that would have done credit to a court stenographer. He gave us the hour of Lark's arrival, the hour of his departure from the library, the names of every guest who had passed through that room, and the exact disposition of the furniture, all without apparent effort, and I confess I thought him at the time the most helpful witness in the house. It was Holmes, characteristically, who saw further. As we prepared to leave the library, I observed Colonel Bellaire's eye fall upon a faded photograph in a silver frame that stood upon Sir Claudius's desk, and I saw him look away from it with an abruptness that seemed to me quite disproportionate to so small a thing. Later, when Sir Claudius had withdrawn to see to some household matter, I noticed Mrs. Harcourt hesitate over the visitor's book that Vane had produced for our inspection, her pen suspended above the page, as though some earlier form of her own name had very nearly escaped her hand. And I saw Vane himself, the moment his employer's back was turned, reach out and quietly lay the silver-frame photograph face downward upon the desk, with the unhurried deliberation of a man performing a habitual small service, rather than concealing anything at all. Holmes said nothing of these things until we stood once more upon the pavement outside, though I had marked his eyes moving from face to face throughout the interviews with the restless attention of a man assembling piece by piece a picture whose final shape he had not yet glimpsed. We had scarcely gone a dozen paces when the front door opened again behind us, and the manservant hurried down the steps to intercept a boy who had come, breathless, with an envelope for Sir Claudius, an envelope I noted that bore no stamp and no postmark, having evidently been delivered by hand. Holmes turned sharply at the sound and watched with narrowed eyes as the servant carried it within. "That envelope, Watson," said he quietly as we walked on toward the park gates, "was not left by any ordinary messenger, or the boy would not have run. I should dearly like to know what it contains, though I think I can already form a fair notion of its general character. We shall learn more, I fancy, before very much longer, and I do not think we shall have to wait for the telling." He would say no more, though I pressed him, and we walked the rest of the way to Baker Street in a silence broken only by the sound of the evening traffic and the distant mournful call of a river barge somewhere beyond the trees. Chapter 3. Death in the Locked Library. I was wakened the following morning by a most insistent knocking upon my bedroom door, and found, upon descending, a telegraph boy already departing, and Holmes standing in his dressing gown with a slip of paper in his hand, and an expression upon his face that I had learned, over the years, to associate with grave and settled matters rather than idle curiosity. "Sir Claudius Merivale is dead, Watson," said he without preamble. "Murdered, if the word Lestrade has chosen means anything at all, in his own library, behind a bolted door. Dress quickly, I have already sent for a cab." We were at Merivale House within the half hour, and found it transformed from the ordered, severe household of the previous afternoon into a scene of subdued confusion. A constable stood at the library door, and within Inspector Lestrade himself was directing 2 men in the removal of a shattered chair, while a third made notes upon the position of the furniture with a tape measure. Sir Claudius sat, or rather had been left sitting, in the great chair behind his desk, his head fallen forward, and a narrow wound beneath his collar that had bled but little, considering its evident depth. The ceremonial dagger that I had noted above the mantel on our previous visit was gone from its hook, and lay, dark along its blade, upon the desk before him. "A bad business, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, coming forward with the particular briskness he affects when he believes a case to be nearly solved. "And not so difficult a one as it might appear, whatever the look of the room suggests. The door was bolted upon the inside. You may examine the bolt for yourself, and the windows are fastened as they have been fastened, the housekeeper tells me, since the first frost of the season. No man came in or went out by any ordinary means, and yet here he sits. Holmes had already crossed to the door and was examining the bolt with his lens, a heavy horizontal affair of old brass, worn smooth with generations of use. The room suggests a confrontation, Lestrade, whatever else it may or may not suggest. Look at that overturned chair, and the ash scattered there upon the carpet, and the brandy glass smashed against the fender. These are not the signs of a man surprised in his sleep. Just so, and that is precisely my difficulty, said Lestrade, with the air of a man confessing a private worry. For if no one entered the room, then the confrontation must have been between Sir Claudius and someone already within it, or else the man was his own murderer, which the wound itself makes absurd. I have two theories, Mr. Holmes, and I do not mind telling you both, since I know you will form your own regardless. Let me hear them. The first is this Warwick, the Corinthian fellow the missing order was meant to arrest. Suppose he learned somehow that the order had been intercepted here, and suppose he came to reclaim it, or to silence the one man who might identify him. The order lies there upon the desk, you will observe. Recovered apparently, though its final page is missing, torn away as neatly as you please. I looked, and saw that it was indeed so. The document lay half unfolded beside the dead man's hand, its bulk suggesting completeness, until one counted the pages and found the last wanting. "And your second theory?" asked Holmes. Lestrade lowered his voice, though there was no one near enough to overhear. "Miss Merivale. She quarrelled with her uncle yesterday evening," the housekeeper heard raised voices before dinner, "and I have this morning learned, from the family solicitor, that Sir Claudius had lately drafted a codicil to his will which would very considerably reduce her inheritance. A draft of that very codicil lies in the safe yonder, which stands open though nothing of value has been taken from it, and there is this." He produced, with something of a flourish, a small button of dark horn backed with a scrap of grey kid glove. Found beneath the desk, not 2 feet from where he sits. A servant, moreover, heard a woman's voice in this room near midnight, though she could not swear to the words. A formidable case, upon its face, Holmes conceded, though his tone carried a reservation that I, at least, had learned to recognise. He crossed the room and stood for some moments regarding the persons now gathered, at Lestrade's direction, in the hall beyond the library door. Helena Merivale, very pale but entirely composed, Colonel Bellairs, who could not keep his eyes from straying again and again toward the desk and the missing page, rather than toward the body of his old acquaintance, and Mrs. Harcourt, who stood a little apart, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. It was she who spoke first as we passed near the little group, addressing Lestrade in a voice pitched somewhat higher than was natural to her. "Inspector, I must ask, has the dagger been examined for fingerprints, or has it already been cleaned?" Lestrade looked faintly surprised. "No one has mentioned fingerprints to you, Mrs. Harcourt, that I am aware." "No," said she, colouring. "No, I suppose no one has," and fell silent, though I saw Holmes's glance move to her face and remain there a moment longer than courtesy strictly required. Miss Merivale, for her part, showed an emotion that struck me even then as curiously misplaced. When Lestrade mentioned the codicil and its effect upon her inheritance, she received the information with something very near indifference, as though it were a matter of small consequence to her. But when her eye fell upon the extradition order lying beside her uncle's hand, she grew, if anything, whiter still, and turned away from the desk with a shudder she made no attempt to disguise. Julian Vane, meanwhile, moved about the room with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown the day before, gathering papers at Lestrade's direction, answering the inspector's questions before they were fully asked, and generally conducting himself as a man determined to be of use in a house suddenly bereft of its master. It was he who remarked, in my hearing, that the library was a room into which no living man could have entered unseen, a phrase that struck me, upon reflection, as an oddly particular way of expressing so simple a fact, though I confess I did not at the time understand why it should be so. Holmes said little more that morning, beyond requesting that nothing in the library be disturbed until he had made a further examination, and that the extradition order, in particular, be left precisely as it lay. But as we descended the steps of Merivale House into the pale winter sunlight, he turned to me with an expression I had come to know well, the look of a man who has been shown a great deal, and believes almost none of it. "Lestrade has his murderess and his motive, Watson. tied up as neatly as a Christmas parcel," said he. "And I confess I have rarely seen a case in which the obvious explanation fitted the visible fact so well, and the visible emotion so badly. A woman who does not care that she is disinherited, and a man who cares nothing for his friend's death but everything for a missing scrap of paper. These are not the reactions of guilt and innocence as I have generally observed them, Watson. They are the reactions of people who know something they have not yet told us, and I begin to suspect it is not at all the something that Lestrade imagines." Chapter 4. The Erased Name. Holmes spent the whole of that afternoon bent over the extradition order in the seclusion of our sitting room, a powerful lens in one hand and, at intervals, a fine camel-hair brush charged with graphite in the other, while I occupied myself with the newspapers and made such contribution to the investigation as an occasional cup of tea and a patient silence could supply. "Come here, Watson, and use your eyes," said he at last, when the light was beginning to fail and Mrs. Hudson had twice looked in to inquire, with some asperity, whether we intended dinner at all that evening. "You will recall that this document was recovered, apparently complete but for its final page, lying beside Sir Claudius's hand. I have now examined it under glass for the better part of 3 hours, and I tell you plainly that it is not the document Lark carried into that library." "Not the same document?" "The same in substance, but altered in particulars, and altered with considerable skill. Look here, at the date." He indicated the heading with the tip of his pencil. "You will observe that the numeral 7 has been very slightly raised above the line of type, as though a fresh figure had been set into a space from which another had been removed. A common typewriting machine cannot make such a substitution without leaving some trace, and here is the trace, a faint doubling of the impression, visible only when the paper is held obliquely to a strong light. I confessed that I could see nothing of the kind until he showed me, and even then it required his guidance before the doubling declared itself to my eye. Now examine this line," he continued, moving his pencil to a sentence some way down the page, "where the original witness to the Corinthian tribunal is named. You will see that the surface of the paper here has a curious sheen, quite unlike the surrounding text, and that the fibres themselves have been very slightly disturbed, as by the application of some chemical reagent. A name has been removed from this line, Watson, dissolved out of the paper as surely as a stain, and another written in its place, though whoever did the writing was skilled enough to match the type almost perfectly." "And the seal?" I asked, for I recalled that the document had borne, upon our first sight of it, the same official device that Holmes had shown me impressed upon the blank sheet the previous evening. "The seal is entirely genuine, which is the most curious feature of the whole affair, but observe the paper immediately beneath it." He turned the sheet toward the lamp, and I saw now, following the line of his finger, a hair's breadth seam running beneath the wax, where 2 pieces of paper had been joined with a skill that would have deceived any eye less exacting than his own. The seal has been lifted whole from another document, and set down again upon this one, over a join so fine that only a magnifying glass and a suspicious temperament will discover it. Someone, Watson, has taken a genuine seal from a genuine paper and married it to a text that is not genuine at all. He set the order aside and drew toward him a sheet of blotting paper which, he informed me, he had removed from the library desk that morning with Lestrade's grudging permission. Across its surface, faint and reversed, lay the ghostly impressions of many hurried notes, overlaid one upon another like the palimpsest of some ancient manuscript. Holmes worked over it for some minutes with his graphite brush, and gradually, beneath the drifting grey powder, there emerged the fragments of a name, written evidently, with some pressure, and in evident haste. "Marek Vassal," I read aloud when the letters had resolved themselves sufficiently. "I do not recall the name appearing anywhere in the order." "Nor does it," said Holmes, "which is precisely why I find it of such interest. Someone in that library wrote this name, upon paper now lost to us, with sufficient force to leave its trace upon the blotter beneath. It does not appear in the document that lay upon Sir Claudius's desk this morning. I begin to suspect, Watson, that it appeared in a version of that document which no longer exists, unless, perhaps, it exists in the grate." This last observation sent him at once to the library, and though Lestrade's men had swept the hearth after their fashion, Holmes discovered, wedged behind the fire-dog where the draught had carried it, a curl of half-burned carbon paper, black and brittle, yet legible in patches where the flame had not quite consumed it. He carried this treasure back to Baker Street with the tenderness of a naturalist bearing home a rare specimen, and spent a further hour coaxing its secrets into the light with the aid of a gentle heat and an infinite patience that I could not have commanded myself. "Here, Watson, is the second version of our extradition order," said he at length, laying the fragile curl upon a sheet of black paper for contrast. "Or rather, here is a carbon copy of it, made, I should judge, at the same sitting as the original, and afterward burned by someone anxious that it should not survive. Read this sentence, if you can." I bent close and made out, letter by painful letter, the words, "The judicial killing of Anton Vassil." "And in the document recovered from the desk," said Holmes, "the corresponding sentence reads merely that Vorik is wanted for murder committed during civil disorder. You perceive the difference, Watson. One version speaks of a judicial killing, an execution sanctioned by some tribunal or court, while the other speaks only of a vague and unattributed murder, as though the whole affair had been nothing more than the chaos of a riot. The order upon Sir Claudius's desk has not merely been stolen and returned, it has been rewritten, deliberately and with skill, to conceal both the true identity of the man who died and the precise nature of the accusation that once hung over him. I own that I found the whole matter growing more tangled rather than less, and said as much. It is tangled because there are, I fancy, several persons in that house, each concealing a different thing, and each concealment casting a shadow across the others," said Holmes, leaning back in his chair. "Consider what we have gathered even today. Miss Merivale confesses when pressed that she entered the library earlier in the evening in search of certain letters of her late father's, a natural enough errand, and yet one she did not think to mention until Lestrade's questions left her no alternative. Colonel Bellairs, I have learned from a discreet inquiry at his club, owes a very considerable sum at cards, and applied to Sir Claudius for assistance within the fortnight. Mrs. Harcourt, unless my information is very much mistaken, once stood upon terms with Sir Claudius a good deal warmer than mere friendship, and may have feared what an old scandal once disturbed might yet bring to light." "Any one of which would furnish a motive," said I. "Any one, or all three, or none," Holmes agreed, "which is precisely the difficulty. Red herrings do not announce themselves as such, Watson. They present exactly the same colouring as the truth, and it's only by tracing each to its source that one may distinguish the fish that swims from the fish that has been dragged across the trail." He glanced at the clock. "And now I learn, by a wire from Lestrade not 20 minutes past, that our missing Corinthian has been run down at last, in a lodging-house near King's Cross. We shall go to him tonight, Watson, for I am curious to see what manner of fear a 25-year-old warrant can still produce in a man's face, and whether it is the fear of a murderer or of something else again." Lestrade, when we met him at the Yard an hour later, was in high good humour, and informed us that Vorik had denied any part in Sir Claudius's death with considerable heat, though he refused absolutely to explain what connection, if any, he had with a man named Anton Vassil, upon whose name he had turned, Lestrade said, the colour of tallow. A newspaper clipping found in his room announced merely the return of Sir Claudius Merivale to England after a long absence abroad, an item, Lestrade thought, that spoke for itself. "The case appears very nearly complete, Mr. Holmes," said the inspector, not without satisfaction. "It appears so," Holmes agreed, in a tone I had learned to distrust above all others, which is very often, in my experience, the surest sign that it is not. Vorik's fear, Lestrade, is not the fear of a murderer confronted with his crime. I have seen that fear 100 times, and it wears a different face altogether. This is the fear of a witness, a man who has spent 25 years dreading the return of something he saw and never did. Chapter 5. The Trial at Drasna. Holmes was, of all men I have known, the least inclined to accept the verdict of history without first examining the evidence upon which it rested, and it did not surprise me, therefore, when he announced, the morning after our interview with Vorik, that he intended to spend the day among the archives rather than among the living. A murder committed yesterday is explained more often than not by something that happened 25 years ago, Watson, said he, drawing on his coat, and I have a fancy that this affair will prove no exception. I'm for the Foreign Office Library, and afterward, I think, the offices of a newspaper that maintained a correspondent in that part of Europe during the years in question. You need not accompany me unless you wish it. There will be a great deal of dust and very little conversation. I went with him nonetheless, as I generally did, and it was well past 4 o'clock before we had assembled. Between us, a picture of what had occurred in the city of Drasna in that distant year. It appeared that the province had passed through a season of considerable unrest, provoked, the official reports vaguely asserted by agitators sympathetic to certain revolutionary elements abroad. A schoolmaster named Anton Vassel had been arrested upon a charge of aiding these agitators and had been brought, in the fullness of time, before a special tribunal convened for the purpose, a tribunal presided over, as the yellowed records plainly showed, by a young English magistrate named Claudius Merivale, then attached to the colonial service in an advisory capacity. Colonel Bellairs, then, I noted, holding no higher rank than major, had served as military liaison to the proceedings, and a British nurse, one Eleanor Dane, had acted as interpreter between the tribunal and the accused. "Eleanor Dane," said Holmes, tapping the yellowed page. "You will recall, Watson, that our Mrs. Harcourt was, at the time of her marriage, a widow of some other name entirely, and that widows very frequently return, upon a second marriage, to names that bear no relation to those they bore before. I think we need not travel far to identify our interpreter." The surviving record was brief, and to my eye at least appeared conclusive. Vassel had confessed under examination to arranging the murder of a royal official some weeks previously, and had been executed the following morning, in accordance with the summary procedure permitted under the emergency statutes then in force. A second man, described only as an accomplice, had escaped the country before he could be taken, and this man, the record noted almost as an afterthought, bore the name Alexander Vorik. A confession, I observed, would seem to settle the matter beyond dispute. It would, Holmes agreed, were the confession itself above suspicion. But observe, Watson, that the document I hold in my hand is not the confession, but only a tribunal officer's summary of it. The confession itself does not appear among these papers at all, and when I inquired of the archivist whether a signed original existed, he informed me, after some searching, that the register from which it should have been copied contains a leaf entirely missing, cut away by the look of the binding rather than lost through accident or age. Moreover, a diplomatic memorandum confirming the execution bears a date 2 days later than the date it purports to record, a discrepancy the archivist could not explain and did not, I think, particularly wish to. And the junior clerk who should have recorded the proceedings? There, Watson, is the most curious omission of all. The official establishment of that tribunal lists no such clerk, and yet he drew out a second sheet, a ledger of expenses meticulously kept by some long-forgotten colonial accountant. Here are payments, quite regular, made throughout the period of the tribunal to a junior legal clerk whose name is nowhere else recorded. A man was paid to attend and to write, Watson, and then was written, himself, out of every subsequent account of the proceedings he attended. We returned to Merivale House that evening, ostensibly to inform the household of the progress of Lestrade's inquiry, though I understood well enough that Holmes's true purpose was to observe rather than to inform. Mrs. Harcourt received us in the drawing-room, and it was there, before Holmes had put a single direct question to her, that she made her confession. "You will have discovered it by now, Mr. Holmes, I'm sure," said she, her hands folded very tightly in her lap, "and I would rather tell it myself than have it dragged from me by an inspector, who thinks the worst of everyone. I was Eleanor Dane. I served as a nurse in Carinthia in my youth, and I acted as interpreter at the trial of which you have been inquiring. I have concealed it these many years for one reason only, and it is not the reason you may suppose. I did not wish my late husband to know that I had once lived a life so far removed from the one I built with him. He was a jealous man, Mr. Holmes, and a foreign service of that kind, undertaken alone and among strangers, would have wounded him more deeply than any infidelity. You maintain, then, that you translated the proceedings accurately?" "I maintain it absolutely," said she, and here I confess her composure faltered a little. Vassel was given every opportunity to answer the charges against him. I translated his words as faithfully as I am able to translate anything, Mr. Holmes, and if his answers did not satisfy the tribunal, that is no fault of mine. It was a curious phrase, and I thought little of it until, an hour later, Colonel Bellairs used almost precisely the same words in his own account of the affair. He had attended the tribunal, he admitted readily enough, in his capacity as liaison, but insisted that the verdict had lain wholly with Sir Claudius, who alone possessed the legal authority to pronounce it. "The man was given every opportunity to answer," said he, with the flat finality of a soldier reciting an order he has long since ceased to question, "and the tribunal found against him. I had no part in the finding, Mr. Holmes, whatever you may have heard to the contrary." Holmes said nothing to either of them regarding the coincidence of phrase, but when we had once more gained the street he remarked upon it at once. "You heard it, Watson? given every opportunity to answer, the very same words from two persons questioned an hour apart, who had, so far as we know, no opportunity to confer between our visits. Such an exact correspondence of language does not arise by chance, Watson, after 25 years. It arises from rehearsal, a form of words agreed upon long ago and repeated ever since, precisely because it has been found to answer every awkward question without in fact answering anything at all. It was Julian Vane, oddly enough, who provided the one note of unguarded sympathy in the whole inquiry. He had spent the better part of the afternoon assisting Holmes among Sir Claudius's private correspondence, locating old letters and dispatches with the same tireless efficiency he brought to every task. And when Holmes remarked, almost idly, upon the sad fate of the schoolmaster Vasile, Vane's reply struck me, in recollection, as oddly heartfelt for a man with no personal connection to the affair. "A dead man cannot argue with the record left behind him, Mr. Holmes," said he quietly. "I have always believed that written records preserve the truth better than memory does, since memory bends to comfort itself, while paper, once set down, does not alter." "Paper," Holmes replied with a small dry smile that I did not, at the time, fully understand, "preserves only what someone has chosen to write upon it, Mr. Vane. And I have found, in the course of a long career, that the choosing is very often the whole of the crime." Chapter 6. 5 Persons and 1 Silence. It was arranged through Lestrade's good offices that Holmes should see the Corinthian Warwick alone, in a bare little room at the police station near King's Cross where he had been detained pending further inquiry. I was permitted to remain, though I confess I said very little throughout the interview, so entirely was my attention given over to watching the man's face as Holmes drew from him, by degrees, a story he had evidently sworn many years before never to tell. He was a spare, grey man, older than his years by every mark of hardship and watching, and he began by repeating in a low, exhausted voice the denial he had already given Lestrade, that he had never entered Merivale House, and had no part in Sir Claudius's death. Holmes heard him out with patience, and then said quietly that he had not come to accuse him of murder, but to ask him about a schoolmaster named Anton Vasile. The effect of the name was extraordinary. The man's composure, such as it was, seemed to drain from him all at once, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, but sat with his hands pressed together as though in an attitude of prayer. "You know the name, then?" he said at last. "I know a little of it," Holmes replied, "and I should like to know the whole. You will find it easier to tell me now, Warwick, than to carry it silently to whatever end this business brings you." And so, haltingly at first, and then with the rush of a man who has held back a flood too long to hold it any further, Warwick told us a story that differed in every essential particular from the tidy record Holmes had already examined. Anton Vasile, he said, had been no revolutionary, but a schoolmaster who had stumbled through the ordinary business of auditing a parish relief fund upon evidence that money sent from England and from the Corinthian treasury alike, intended for the relief of a starving province, was being quietly diverted into private hands. He had carried his discovery to a royal official newly arrived to investigate the very unrest that the withheld relief had done so much to provoke, and that official had promised him protection in exchange for his testimony. Before either promise could be redeemed, the official was found murdered, and within the week Vasile himself stood accused of the crime. "I was present when they questioned him," said Warwick, his voice steadying now that the worst of the telling was behind him. "I will swear to you, Mr. Holmes, upon whatever oath you please, that Anton Vasile never confessed to that killing, not in one word. Instead, when they pressed him, he named the men he believed responsible for the missing relief money: Merivale, Bellairs, the Englishwoman Dane, and a Corinthian minister whose name will mean nothing to you. He named them all, one by one, in full hearing of the court, and there was a young clerk present who wrote down every word of it in the tribunal's own register." "And that clerk?" asked Holmes. "Vanished that same night and was never seen again in Drasna. By morning a confession had appeared in his place. Vasile's confession, they called it, though he had signed nothing, and I do not believe he ever saw the paper before his death. He was executed within the day, before any appeal could be made to the capital." Warwick's hands, I saw, had begun to tremble, though his voice remained level. I took what I could of the clerk's true record, a few pages only smuggled out before the tribunal's papers were sealed, and I fled that same week, believing, as I believed for 25 years that the boy who wrote them had been murdered for his honesty, along with the man whose words he'd set down. Holmes questioned him a while longer upon points of detail, and then thanked him with a gravity I had rarely seen him extend to a man still under suspicion of murder, and we withdrew, leaving Warwick, I think, easier in his mind than he had been for a very long time. Whatever fate the law might yet have in store for him, it was upon our return to Baker Street that Holmes produced, from among the papers he had gathered at the military archive, a photograph, faded and much handled, which he laid beside the one we had seen at Merivale House, retrieved that morning by a discreet arrangement with Vane. 5 figures, Watson, standing before the courthouse at Drasna, said he, setting the 2 images side by side beneath the lamp. In the Merivale House copy, 3 of those faces have been scratched away, so delicately that one must hold the print at an angle to see that the scratching is there at all. But this second copy, preserved untouched in a military collection that no one troubled to disturb, shows all 5 faces plain. Here is the young Merivale, here Bellairs in his subaltern's uniform, here Eleanor Dane. And here, his finger moved to the 2 remaining figures, is Anton Vassil himself, and beside him, a boy of perhaps 18, in the plain coat of a court clerk. His name, according to the archive's own catalogue, was Petr Vassil, Anton's elder son. Then the missing clerk was the schoolmaster's own child. So it would appear. And the name I raised from the blotting paper in Sir Claudius's library, Marek Vasil, belongs, I am now satisfied, to Anton's younger son, a mere infant at the time of the trial, too young to have stood in that photograph at all. Holmes sat back and regarded the 2 faded prints with an expression I found difficult to read. Consider the gathering at Merivale House on the night the order vanished, Watson. Sir Claudius, Bellairs, Mrs. Harcourt, all 3 bound together by that tribunal, 25 years gone. Helena Merivale alone among the guests had no true connection to Drasna. And yet it was Julian Vane who arranged the guest list for that reception. Vane who selected the very photograph that now sits scratched upon Sir Claudius's desk, and Vane, if I am not mistaken, who ensured that Mr. Lark should carry his dispatch wallet through that particular house on that particular evening, rather than by any more direct route to Scotland Yard. The suggestion, once made, seemed to me almost too vast to credit, and I said so. I do not yet accuse him of anything, Watson, beyond a very remarkable talent for arranging coincidences, Holmes replied. But I'm beginning to believe that the interception of that order was never intended in the first instance to save Warwick from arrest at all. I believe it was designed for a single purpose, to draw every surviving witness of the Drasna Tribunal into one room, upon one evening, for the first time in 25 years. Whoever contrived that gathering wanted something from it, Watson, and I do not think that something was the piece of paper Mr. Lark has been so anxious to recover. He fell silent then, and sat long into the evening with the 2 photographs before him, and though I asked him more than once what he believed that something to be, he would give me no answer beyond a slow shake of the head, as a man does who has begun to see a shape in the darkness, but will not name it until he is certain it is not merely a shadow of his own casting. Chapter 7. The Secretary's Evidence. We had scarcely finished breakfast the following morning when a wire arrived from Lestrade, couched in language so triumphant that I could almost hear the inspector's voice through the terse official phrasing. Holmes read it twice, his eyebrows lifting a fraction upon the second reading, and passed it across the table to me without comment. Discovery made. Cuff. Blood-stained. Missing page found. Bellairs motor car. Come at once. We found Lestrade at Merivale House in a state of scarcely contained satisfaction, standing before a table upon which 2 objects had been laid out with the careful precision of a man displaying trophies. The first was a linen cuff, torn from its shirt, stained dark along one fold. The second was a single sheet of paper, evidently the missing final leaf of the extradition order, upon which a hand I recognised, from documents Holmes had shown me, as Sir Claudius's own had written a brief and damning accusation that Colonel Adrian Bellairs had falsified the confession attributed to Anton Vasil 25 years before. Mr. Vane found them not an hour ago, said Lestrade with the air of a conjurer unveiling his final trick, concealed beneath the seat of Colonel Bellairs' motor car, in the mews behind this very house. I need hardly point out to you, Mr. Holmes, that a man who conceals a blood-stained cuff and a written accusation against himself is not a man with an easy conscience. Holmes took up the cuff and examined it beneath his lens for what seemed to me an unreasonably long interval, given that its message appeared, upon the face of it, so simple. "You're quite right that this cuff has a story to tell, Lestrade," said he at length, "though I am not yet convinced it is the story you have assigned to it. Watson, be so good as to look here." I bent over the stained linen as he directed, and saw that the darkened patch lay chiefly along the folded edge of the cuff, spreading inward toward the button rather than outward from it. "You will observe," said Holmes, "that blood from a wound at the wrist, soaking into a cuff still worn upon the arm, spreads outward from the point of contact, following the movement of the hand and the pull of gravity as the arm is used. This stain does precisely the opposite. It has soaked inward from the folded edge, as blood will do when a cuff, already removed from its owner, is laid flat upon some stained surface and left to absorb what lies beneath it. This cuff, Lestrade, was stained after it was taken off, not while it was being worn." Lestrade's satisfaction dimmed a shade, though he was not a man to surrender a theory without a struggle. "Perhaps he removed it in some confusion after the deed?" "Perhaps, Sesson," said Holmes, "though I think we shall find a simpler explanation before very long." He turned his attention to the written page, and his examination of this occupied him longer still. "The hand is Sir Claudius's, or a very close copy of it. The copyist has taken pains and taken them well. But look at the ink, Lestrade, and tell me what you see." Lestrade peered obediently, though I could see he possessed neither the training nor, I suspect, the patience for so minute an examination. "This ink," Holmes continued, "has the particular dullness that comes upon iron gall ink only after some months of exposure to air, a dullness quite different from the sheen of a line written within the last few days. The sentence accusing Bellairs was not composed on the night of the murder. It has been assembled, Lestrade, from portions of some earlier letter of Sir Claudius's, the original words scraped away here and there by chemical means, and the gaps filled with connecting phrases written afterward, in an ink that very nearly but not quite matches the rest." "You are suggesting the whole page is a forgery," said Lestrade, with the flat tone of a man watching a promising theory dissolve before his eyes. "I am suggesting a great deal more than that," Holmes replied, "though I will reserve the whole of it a little longer, for I have not yet finished with this page. Read me the final line, if you will, Watson." I read aloud, "I accuse Colonel Adrian Bellairs of having falsified the confession of Anton Vasile." "Colonel Adrian Bellairs," Holmes repeated softly. "Lestrade, I have had occasion, in the course of this inquiry, to examine a good deal of Sir Claudius's private correspondence spanning some 25 years, and in not one instance, not one, out of perhaps 40 letters in which the gentleman is mentioned, does Sir Claudius refer to him by any style other than Major Bellairs, the rank he held during their service together at Drasna. He continued to use it, out of old habit or old courtesy, long after Bellairs' later promotion. Whoever wrote this final accusation knew Colonel Bellairs as the public world knows him today. He did not know him as Sir Claudius knew him in the private shorthand of 25 years' acquaintance." There was a silence in the room while this observation settled upon us, and I confess I felt something of the chill that a courtroom must feel when a verdict long assumed begins, quite suddenly, to totter. Lestrade, to his credit, did not abandon his case without a further struggle, and proceeded over the course of that afternoon to marshal what evidence remained to him. Colonel Bellairs was arrested before evening upon the strength of his gambling debts, which a discreet inquiry among the moneylenders of St. James's had shown to be very considerable indeed, and upon a fresh report taken from a housemaid that she had heard the Colonel and Sir Claudius exchange angry words upon the night of the murder, words she had not liked to repeat until pressed a second time. The ceremonial dagger itself, examined by a specialist Lestrade had engaged, was found to carry several fibres consistent with the weave of Bellairs' evening coat, caught, presumably, when the weapon was drawn from its sheath. Mrs. Harcourt, questioned separately, confirmed something further, that Bellairs, at the time of the Drasna tribunal, had pressed hardest of anyone present for Vasile's swift execution, being anxious, she believed, to see the unrest suppressed before it could spread to the garrison under his command. And Helena Merivale, recalled to give a further account of her movements, admitted that she had seen a figure she took to be the Colonel loitering near the library corridor a little after midnight, though she had thought nothing of it at the time, supposing him merely restless after the evening's wine. I confess that, hearing all this arrayed together, I found the case against Bellairs very difficult to resist. He had, it seemed, both an old crime to conceal from 25 years past, and a present and pressing quarrel with the one man who might yet expose his debts to the world. And here now was physical evidence, a stained cuff, a written accusation, fibres upon the very weapon, binding the two motives into a single, coherent guilt. Holmes, however, remained unmoved by the whole accumulation, and said as much to me that evening, as we sat once more before our own fire in Baker Street. "It is a very complete case, Watson, and that is precisely what troubles me about it," said he, knocking out his pipe against the grate with rather more force than the operation required. "Every fact Lestrade has gathered today points to Bellairs, and points with such unanimity that I begin to suspect the pointing was arranged rather than discovered. A cuff stained after its removal, an accusation written in old ink and assembled from another man's letters, a dagger bearing fibres that anyone might have transferred from a coat hanging, as I happen to know Bellairs' coat was hanging that evening, upon a stand in the entrance hall, accessible to every soul in the house. These are not the traces a murderer leaves behind him in the heat of his own crime, Watson. They are the traces a very careful person leaves behind for someone else to find." "You believe Bellairs innocent, then?" "I believe Bellairs guilty of a great many things, of cowardice, of debt, of a silence maintained for 25 years that he ought long ago to have broken," said Holmes. "But guilty of murder in a bolted room, from which, whatever else is true of that library, he did not depart by any door or window known to Lestrade's investigation? No, Watson, I do not believe that of him at all. There is a bolt in that room, and a manner of leaving it fastened from without, that I have not yet fully proved, though I begin to see very dimly how it might be done. Tomorrow, I think, we shall test the theory upon the room itself, rather than upon the persons who pass through it. Chapter 8. The Experiment with the Library Door. Holmes was astir before I had finished my coffee the following morning, and informed me with the brisk energy of a man who has passed a wakeful night to good purpose, that he had arranged a small experiment at Merivale House, and that he wished both Lestrade and myself to witness it. "The whole of Lestrade's locked-room mystery rests upon a single assumption, Watson," said he, as our cab rattled toward Regent's Park, "namely that the library bolt could be moved only from within the room itself. It is a natural assumption, and it is very probably wrong, and I mean to prove as much this morning before witnesses whose good faith cannot afterward be questioned." We found Lestrade waiting for us in the library, wearing the guarded expression of a man who suspects he's about to be shown something he would rather not see. And Vane and Helena Merivale had also been asked to attend, at Holmes's particular request, in order, as he put it, to reproduce as nearly as possible their movements upon the night of the murder. Holmes went first to the door, and examined the old brass bolt with a care I had seen him bestow upon it before, then produced from his pocket a length of fine waxed cord and a small brass fitting, no larger than a shirt button, which he held up for our inspection. "This," said he, "is a stop, of a pattern common enough in old ironmongery, whose purpose is to prevent the bolt from being drawn back except by a hand within the room. Without such a stop, a length of cord passed beneath the door and looped about the bolt's handle through the keyhole may be drawn taut from the corridor outside, and the bolt lifted as neatly as by a hand at the door itself." He fitted a cord through the keyhole as he spoke, looped it with practised fingers about the bolt, and drew it gently from without. The bolt rose, slid back along its groove, and the door swung open beneath the lightest pressure. "You will observe, Lestrade, that this bolt carries no such stop at present. It may be worked from either side of this door with no greater skill than I have just now demonstrated." Lestrade examined the bolt himself, his brow furrowed. "But if the stop is missing, Mr. Holmes, then surely it was always missing, and the room was never truly secure at all. A fault of the house, not a device of the murderers." "That is precisely what I intended to ask Mr. Vane," said Holmes, turning to the secretary, who stood a little apart, watching the demonstration with a composure I had, until that moment, taken for granted rather than examined. "I am afraid I can offer very little upon the point," said Vane readily. "I believe Sir Claudius mentioned some weeks ago that the bolt required attention, and that a man had been engaged to repair it." "A most convenient recollection," Holmes observed, "and one I took the liberty of testing against the household account book before we came here this morning." He produced the volume from beneath his arm, a heavy leather-bound ledger, and opened it to a marked page. "I have gone through every entry for the quarter, Mr. Vane, and I find payments recorded for the sweeping of chimneys, for the mending of a garden wall, for the replacement of a broken pane in the conservatory, but no entry whatsoever for any repair to this door or to any door in the house. No locksmith has been paid, and none, so far as this book records, was ever engaged." Vane's composure did not desert him. though I fancied I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Then I have been misinformed, Mr. Holmes, or my memory of the matter is simply at fault. It is some weeks since the remark was made, if it was made at all. It may well be, Holmes agreed pleasantly, though I would observe that you, Mr. Vane, catalogued the whole of this house's fittings upon Sir Claudius's return to England scarcely a year ago, and that you are, by your own earlier account, the person most familiar with every lock and bolt beneath this roof. But let that pass for the present. I have a further matter to demonstrate. He crossed to the mantel, where the empty hook still showed above the fireplace, and produced the ceremonial dagger itself, wrapped for the occasion in a cloth. This weapon hung upon its hook, undisturbed, for years, if the household's own account is to be trusted. Dust settles upon a hook of this kind, Lestrade, in a manner quite undisturbed by a single removal on the night of a crime, and remains, beneath the guard of a blade so hung, in an unbroken layer. But observe. He replaced the dagger upon its hook, drew it down again, and repeated the motion several times before running his gloved finger along the small ledge beneath. You will see for yourselves that no dust remains here at all, not a film, not a trace, but a clean semicircle, precisely the shape a blade's guard describes when drawn up and set down repeatedly. This weapon was taken from its place, and returned to it many times before it was ever used in earnest, Lestrade. Someone rehearsed this crime, in this very room, upon more than one occasion before the night it was finally committed. A silence followed this observation, broken at last by Lestrade, who asked, in a voice a shade less confident than his customary tone, what Holmes made of the servant's report, the woman's voice heard in the library near midnight, which had told so heavily, until now, against Miss Merivale. I have a demonstration for that also, said Holmes, and led us from the library into the small office adjoining it, where Sir Claudius's secretary had evidently transacted the more routine business of the estate. In the wall between the two rooms, half concealed behind a hanging map, an old ventilation grille of ornamental ironwork admitted a current of air between the chambers. Watson, be so good as to return to the library and speak a few words through this grille in your ordinary voice, while we listen from this side. I did as he directed, feeling somewhat foolish, and recited the first lines of a sonnet that came to mind, in a voice I made no particular effort to disguise. When I rejoined the others, Lestrade admitted with evident reluctance that the words that had reached him through the grille had come distorted and pitched unnaturally high, so that he could not, upon his oath, have sworn to the speaker's sex, let alone their identity. The servant did not hear a woman's voice within the library at all, said Holmes. She heard a man's voice from this office, carried and altered by the very grille through which Watson has just spoken, and mistook quite naturally its distorted pitch for that of a woman speaking in the room beyond. He turned then to Vane, and his manner, though still perfectly courteous, had acquired an edge I had not heard him use before that morning. One question more, Mr. Vane, and I confess it is the one that has troubled me longest. When you described this library to Inspector Lestrade, upon the morning the body was discovered, you did not say that no one could have entered it. You said that no living man could have entered it. It is a curious form of words, Mr. Vane, and I have turned it over a great many times since I first heard it. I should be glad if you would tell me why you chose it. For the first time since I had known him, Julian Vane's composure failed him utterly. The colour left his face, his hands, which had rested so easily at his sides throughout the whole of Holmes's demonstration, closed slowly into fists, and he stood for a long moment without answering, while the four of us watched him in a silence that seemed, to me, to stretch on very much longer than the clock upon the mantel could have honestly accounted for. I think, Mr. Holmes, said he at last, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, that you had better ask me that question again this evening, when I have had time to consider my answer properly. Holmes bowed very slightly, as though the request were the most natural thing in the world. This evening, then, Mr. Vane, in this room, and I think it would be as well if every person who dined at this house upon the night the order vanished were to be present also, for I believe we have very nearly reached the end of a story that began 25 years ago, in a city none of us has ever seen. Chapter 9. The son of Anton Vasile. We assembled that evening in the library at Merivale House, in a scene that seemed to me to gather up, like the final act of some sombre drama, every thread that had been spun out across the preceding fortnight. Helena Merivale sat near the fire, very pale, but composed. Colonel Bellairs, released that afternoon from custody at Holmes's own insistence, occupied a chair by the window, watching the proceedings with the wary stillness of a man who does not yet know whether he is to be accused or vindicated. Mrs. Harcourt sat a little apart, her hands folded in her lap, and Lestrade stood near the door, notebook in hand, with the expression of a man determined to follow every word, however the case might ultimately fall. Julian Vane alone remained standing near the desk at which his employer had died, his face composed once more into something very like its old, quiet efficiency, though I fancied I could see beneath it the strain of a man awaiting a sentence he had already, in his own heart, pronounced upon himself. Holmes began, as was his custom, not with the truth, but with the case that had so very nearly obscured it. "I will dispose first of the theory that has occupied Inspector Lestrade these several days," said he, "for it does its subject, Colonel Bellairs, a considerable injustice, and I think it right that the injustice be undone before we proceed further. The blood-stained cuff found in the Colonel's motor-car was stained after its removal, not while worn, as any careful examination of the pattern of absorption will show. The written accusation against him was assembled from fragments of Sir Claudius's older correspondence, in ink some months old, and betrayed its forger by a single word, for it named the Colonel by a rank Sir Claudius had not used of him in 25 years of private letters, and the fibres upon the dagger which seemed at first so damning came, I am satisfied, from a coat that hung that evening not upon the Colonel's back, but upon a stand in this house's own entrance hall, accessible to any hand that cared to brush against it. Colonel Bellairs' debts and his old silence made him a convenient figure to accuse. They did not, and could not, place him within a room that was bolted that night from a hand other than his own. Bellairs said nothing, but I saw the tension go out of his heavy shoulders by a degree that told me more plainly than any word how greatly the accusation had weighed upon him. "I turn now," Holmes continued, "to the extradition order itself, for I do not believe its interception was ever intended to save Alexander Vorich from arrest. It was intended to accomplish something a great deal more particular, and to understand it we must return to a courtroom in the city of Drasna 25 years ago." He glanced as he said this toward Julian Vane, whose stillness had, if anything, deepened. A schoolmaster named Anton Vasile was tried before a tribunal that included among its officers the young Claudius Merivale, then a junior magistrate, Major Adrian Bellairs, as he then was, serving as military liaison, and an Englishwoman named Eleanor Dane, who served the court as interpreter. Mrs. Harcourt's hand rose briefly to her throat, but she said nothing, and Holmes went on. Vasile did not confess to the murder of which he was accused. He named instead the persons he believed responsible for diverting the relief funds his own inquiries had uncovered, a list that included Merivale, Bellairs, and Mrs. Dane herself. A young court clerk recorded his words in full. That clerk vanished the same night, and a false confession, unsigned, appeared in his place by morning. Vasile was executed before any appeal could reach the capital, and the truth of what he had actually said went with him, or so it was believed, into the grave. "The clerk," said Holmes, turning now fully toward Vane, "was not murdered, as Vorich has believed for 25 years. He survived, though he did not remain in Corinthia, and he did not, I think, remain under the name his father had given him. He is standing in this room tonight." The silence that followed was of a different quality altogether from any that had preceded it, complete and very long, until Vane himself broke it, in a voice that had lost every trace of the deferential precision I had grown accustomed to hearing from him. "My name," said he, "is Marek Vasile. Petar was my brother." He told the rest of it himself, standing very straight beside the desk at which the man who had wronged his family lay dead, and I set it down here as nearly as I can recall his words, though I confess the telling moved me a great deal more than I had expected any confession to do. Petar Vasile, the elder brother, had not perished that night in Drasna as Vorich had supposed, but had been spirited away, gravely injured, by friends of his father who dared not keep him in the country. He lived long enough, some years later, to send a coded letter into England, indicating that the tribunal's true record, his own true record taken down in his own hand on the night of his father's interrogation, had been hidden, for safety, among papers that had passed, by some chance of custody, into Sir Claudius Merivale's own keeping. Peter died before the letter could be followed further, but Marek, raised abroad under an assumed name after his father's death, resolved to recover what his brother had preserved at so great a cost. "I entered Sir Claudius's service as Julian Vane 2 years ago," said he, "and I will not pretend that patience came easily to me. I catalogued his house. I learned his habits, his locks, his private papers, down to the last drawer of the last cabinet. I arranged, when I learned that Sir Claudius was to attend a reception, at which an official from the Foreign Office would be present, that Mr. Lark's route should bring him and his dispatch wallet through this house. I did not want the extradition order for Warwick's sake, Mr. Holmes, whatever else you may have supposed. I wanted every survivor of that tribunal gathered beneath one roof, for the first time since Drasna, so that I might watch their faces when Warwick's name was spoken, and know at last which of them still carried the guilt I had spent my whole life believing had been buried with my father." On the night of the murder he had found, at last, the hidden record, his brother's own notes concealed within the library safe, and had confronted Sir Claudius with them, demanding a written and public admission of the truth. Sir Claudius had refused, declaring, in words Vane repeated with a bitterness that had clearly not dulled with the telling, that the dead could no longer be helped, and that the honour of living institutions mattered more in the end than any truth that could serve them nothing. He said that to me, Mr. Holmes, standing where you stand now, and I confess that in that moment I ceased to be Julian Vane at all. He did not describe the act itself, nor did any of us ask him to. He told us, instead, in the same flat, exhausted voice, how he had staged the appearance of a struggle, planted the stained cuff and the forged accusation to fall upon Bellairs, and slipped away through the ventilation grill's adjoining office, after drawing the bolt shut behind him with the cord and the missing brass stop which he produced, at Holmes's quiet request, from his own waistcoat pocket. Holmes had not needed the confession to know it. He told us so himself, once Vane had fallen silent, enumerating in the same unhurried voice he might have used to describe a chemical experiment, the accumulated contradictions that had led him, step by step, to the truth. Vane's exact knowledge of vassal family names before any document had named them to him, his careful avoidance and later concealment of a photograph he could not bear to look upon, his ignorance of Sir Claudius's private form of address for Bellairs, though he knew every public fact about the colonel, his control, absolute and unremarked, of the guest list, the photograph's placement, and the fittings of every lock in the house, and above all, that single revealing phrase, "No living man," spoken by one who knew, better than any soul in London, that the dead too sometimes returned. Vane made no attempt at denial, then or afterward. He stood in silence while Lestrade, moving at last, laid a hand upon his shoulder, and his face alone, pale and very still beneath the library lamp, confirmed every word that Holmes had spoken. Chapter 10. What the Years Preserve. Marek Vassal was formally charged with the murder of Sir Claudius Merivale within the week, and made, so far as I ever learned, no attempt to dispute the charge before the court that received it. Colonel Bellairs, cleared entirely of that accusation, did not escape the law's attention altogether, for the disclosures that followed Vane's confession opened an inquiry, conducted with rather more discretion than speed, into the falsification of the Drasna Tribunal's record, and into certain irregularities, dating from the same period, in the administration of the relief funds Anton Vasile had died attempting to expose. The colonel was detained pending that inquiry, and I confess I could summon little sympathy for him. Whatever relief I had felt upon Holmes's proof of his innocence in the library itself, Mrs. Harcourt came to Baker Street of her own accord some days later, and gave Holmes, in my presence, a full and unguarded account of her own part in the old affair. She admitted, with a candour that seemed to cost her a great deal, that she had deliberately softened and mistranslated certain portions of Anton Vassal's testimony at the tribunal, under pressure from the young Claudius Merivale, who had threatened, she said, to accuse her before the diplomatic mission of espionage on Corinthia's behalf unless she rendered his words more conveniently for the court's purpose. She had not, she insisted, and I believed her, sought Vassal's death, but she acknowledged, with tears she did not trouble to hide from us, that her silence, both then and through all the years that followed, had helped to make that death possible, and had helped, too, to bury it beyond any ordinary reach of justice. "I've carried it a very long time, Mr. Holmes," said she as she rose to leave us. "I find, now that it is known, that the carrying of it was very much the heavier burden." Holmes bowed her out with a gentleness I had not always seen him extend to witnesses less honest in their remorse, and said nothing further upon the subject until she had gone. The extradition order itself, or rather the truth that lay beneath its forged and rewritten text, proved sufficient to suspend, and I believe ultimately to quash, the case against Alexander Vorik. Holmes presented to the Foreign Office, through channels I was never entirely permitted to trace, the fragments of Peter Vassal's original tribunal notes, recovered at last from Sir Claudius's safe, together with such evidence as remained of the manufactured confession and the altered warrant. The department, faced with proof that the charges against Vorik rested upon testimony extracted under a false name for a crime that had never in truth occurred as officially recorded, opened a quiet inquiry of its own into the whole of the Drasner affair, an inquiry which, Holmes remarked to me with a certain dry satisfaction, would very probably take a good deal longer to conclude than the murder that had prompted it. Helena Merivale! I saw once more before the case passed finally from our hands, and found her a good deal changed from the guarded young woman who had first received us in her uncle's library. She had learned, by then, the whole of what her uncle had done, and had done nothing to prevent, across 25 years of comfortable silence, and she did not attempt when I spoke with her to soften or excuse it. "I will not pretend he was other than he was, Doctor," said she, "nor will I pretend that what I have learned has left me nothing to grieve. He was still my uncle, and he was, in the small daily kindnesses a household knows, a kind man to me. But I cannot build my future upon the silence that built his. She told me she intended to devote a considerable portion of the estate that would now come to her toward the relief of families still suffering, in that distant province, the consequences of the funds diverted so long ago. A decision, she said, that felt less like an act of restitution than a very small repayment upon a debt no fortune could ever fully discharge." It was upon the evening after her visit that Holmes and I sat once more before our own fire. The case, in all its official particulars, at last concluded, and I found myself turning the whole strange business over in my mind as a man turns a coin whose true value he has only just come to understand. "It is a curious thing, Holmes," said I, "that a case which began with a missing government paper should end, in truth, with nothing of the sort at all. It never truly concerned the paper, Watson, any more than a fever truly concerns the thermometer that records it," Holmes replied, drawing meditatively upon his pipe. "The paper was a symptom merely, the visible mark left upon the surface of things by an infection that had been working silently for 25 years in the depths beneath. The decisive event in this whole affair did not occur in a locked library last Tuesday night, Watson. It occurred in a Corinthian courtroom a quarter of a century ago, when 4 frightened people, each for reasons of their own, agreed together that silence was a safer companion than truth. And silence very nearly won," said I. "Silence very nearly always wins, Watson, which is why I have so little patience with those who tell me the past cannot harm us." He was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "Time does not erase guilt, whatever comfortable people would have us believe of it. It merely removes the witnesses, one by one, until the last surviving trace of a crime appears too small, too faded, too easily overlooked to matter to anyone still living. A scratched photograph, an impression upon a sheet of blotting paper, a phrase repeated without thought by 2 people who had rehearsed it years before either of us was born. These are the small things time leaves behind when it has taken everything else, Watson, and it is by such small things, and no others, that the dead are sometimes permitted after all to speak." I thought, as he said this, of the photograph we had first seen upon Sir Claudius's desk. 5 figures before a courthouse, 3 faces scratched almost to invisibility, and of how patiently and how completely an old and comfortable world had laboured to remove them from its memory. Names had been erased from documents, records rewritten, faces cut away with a careful blade, and yet beneath the surface of it all, like the ghost of a seal pressed into paper long after the wax itself has been lifted away, one faint impression had remained, and from that impression, and from nothing more substantial than his own unwearied attention to the small and the overlooked, my friend had restored to the world a history that 4 frightened people had spent a quarter of a century trying to persuade even themselves had never truly happened at all.